We are live. Corey, appreciate you taking some time to come on the podcast. Just to kick it off, will you let the audience know a little background? Corey met with me and I wrote an article about him for Bitcoin News. Makes some of the most beautiful Bitcoin golf clubs, and if I was better at golf, I would buy a bunch of them, but I'm still trying to break 100 here, so not yet, but one day.
I mean, most people in golf are, man. You put people in tournament conditions and make them play from the tips, and basically nobody's breaking 100. The overwhelming majority of people would not break 100 under tournament conditions playing from the tips.
Well, I appreciate that. Makes it
so don't feel too bad. So yeah, I've been in business since 2018, which is ironically kind of when I first started like reading about Bitcoin. I read this book called Digital Gold by Nathaniel Popper, and didn't walk away from reading that book thinking like, oh, like this is the biggest discovery since electricity or Einstein's theory of relativity. I really feel at modern and present day that Bitcoin is on that sort of level. So the first few years of my career, I say 2018 to 2020, I really wasn't thinking about Bitcoin payments or, getting real serious about saving in Bitcoin. Then the pandemic happened, man. I think so many people can relate that, just the terrible things the government did and all the lives that were destroyed by the things that they did. It really kind of woke me up to how powerful this technology is. And, I know in the last time we talked about, picking up the Bitcoin standard for the first time, which was, for me in late 2020. And I talk about a life-changing moment like that. That's what really shoved me down the rabbit hole. and
that book is so powerful. Thomas Massey literally introduced the congressman from Kentucky, introduced the bill to the Federal Reserve after listening to it on
yeah.
It's a pretty powerful book.
Or Michael Saylor, he reads the Bitcoin standard and all of a sudden, he's got billions and billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. And, I've Bitcoin, making golf clubs is, my trade, but, Bitcoin is not only a passion, it's become like this holy crusade for me. I just have for so long been trying to think of like, how I can incorporate Bitcoin into what I'm doing with my golf brand. And that really kind of dissolves into a discussion about Bitcoin and small businesses in general. I think if I could sum it up, I really just would like to be some sort of help in spreading this message to other small business owners. I think small business owners saving in Bitcoin and making Bitcoin their primary treasury asset is something that could really change the world. And so people always ask like, well, what does golf and Bitcoin have to do with each other? Well, nothing, like on the surface, not that much, but when you get into the nitty gritty of what using Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset as a small business can do for you over the long run, then it starts to become a little more obvious what Bitcoin can do in terms of increasing purchasing power, and increasing an increase in purchasing power is going to allow you more options as a small business owner. And so it's like why take the time to do this podcast and stuff is we're just having a little circle jerk about Bitcoin here. No, I think I just want to do my part in just trying to educate other small business owners. I've already enjoyed very substantial increases in purchasing power in my personal Bitcoin stack. I aped in like a madman when things crashed to 15K. And, it's really given me a very solid savings base. I know I could take my Bitcoin, and if some emergency pops up, or just there's so many ways in which increased purchasing power will benefit you. Once you start really thinking about it, it's really quite a game changer. And so that's why I'm here. Is just trying to help spread the message. And even if you're listening and you're not in the golf industry, this technology, it could be a game changer for you. And I just hope to be a living example of that.
Yeah, I think it's a really profound point, especially for small businesses. It's hard to compete with some of these massive companies, Walmart, Target, Amazon, Apple, especially because the cost of capital for these businesses is so much less, which is understandable if you're a bank and you're trying to assess risk. You'd be pretty confident that Walmart, Target, Amazon, Apple, you name Microsoft, whatever big company, is going to be able to pay back whatever money you lend to them. But, as a small business, if you're producing a surplus and you have some excess cash flows and you want to put that in something that is going to appreciate over time, I mean, there's no question. If you can hold long term, think, zoom out, the returns for Bitcoin, nothing's come close. I mean, it's broken almost every financial record. And one of the things that I really appreciated when I was learning more about what you wanted to do with your business in writing that article is how you mentioned that you wanted to try and onshore some of the manufacturing process and make the clubs in the USA. And right now, due to the Triffin's dilemma, which basically says if you're the global reserve currency, and we're both in the United States, we obviously reside in a place that has a global reserve currency, you have to hollow out your manufacturing base because you have to export dollars globally, which means that it's just not competitive to have manufacturing in the United States. All that manufacturing goes overseas, and as a result, it hollows out the manufacturing base here. When you have small businesses who see a very nice amount of capital appreciation, who might not be able to borrow money or do some of these things that these bigger companies can do just because they're so big and their cost of capital is so much cheaper, I think it really flips that incentive and makes it so we can onshore more manufacturing, and small businesses can thrive and grow, especially ones that are successful and have excess cash but don't really know what to do with it. And obviously fiat's a melting ice cube, so if they just keep it as cash, they're just losing purchasing power over the long term.
Yeah, in my case, I buy lots of I need lots of day-to-day equipment that needs to constantly be replaced. Like, for example, grinding wheels for shaping the clubs and whatnot. This one wheel in particular has more than doubled in price since I started out in 2018. It used to be one price, and now it's more than double what it was when I started out. And I could sit here all morning and tell you about very similar situations with other pieces of equipment and things that need to be replenished constantly, and just general cost of operating. How do you get off of this treadmill? And going back to your point about trying to bring manufacturing back here, um, when you really sit down and think, why am I having my clubs made on the other side of the world? Why do I go through this hassle of having things made way over there and having to be shipped over here? That's a rabbit hole, man. Like, it's a huge rabbit hole. And I think back, like, when we were on a gold standard, basically from the end of the Civil War up to the creation of the Federal Reserve. Because me personally, I don't view us as having gone off the gold standard in 1971. We went off the gold standard. Not that even we were never truly on a pure gold standard, but we were on a gold standard as much as we could have been. I would say from the end of the Civil War all the way up to the creation of the Federal Reserve. And one thing you notice before the creation of the Federal Reserve is that banking in particular was becoming more and more localized. You were seeing a lot of banks popping up in communities, and like when your purchasing power continues to accrue, like there's less and less reason to go outside of your community for the things you need. And so if we just look at the US as one big community, we have everything we need in the US to have a great manufacturing base. I know this because we once had a great manufacturing base. And for a plethora of reasons, and most of them being how the financial system is currently set up. It's all just been hollowed out, and everything from the banking has, the Federal Reserve gets created, and all of a sudden things start gradually becoming more and more centralized in the banking world in Manhattan and the big cities. And, you start over time, you just get these giant banking corporations, and you're not seeing as many local banks anymore. And it's the same thing with manufacturing. It's just across the board. And this is why we have the phrase, fix the money, fix the world, because like once you start going down this rabbit hole, you just see it everywhere. And at a certain level of purchasing power, when you've been saving in Bitcoin for a while, it's like, well, like if I have so much purchasing power now, like I'll just buy a machine and make it here. And it increases in purchasing power. It allows you to do so much. Me personally, and this is where I think things will really. This is where I think things will go in the U.S. so long as we have capital gains tax on the use of your Bitcoin, is that people will stack Bitcoin and take loans against it. For me, I have not done this yet, but I kind of I have a stacking goal, and I don't really want to put my coins at risk until I'm at a certain level. And I guess I kind of differ from most Bitcoiners in that I don't see Bitcoin really as a medium of exchange, especially because of the tax situation. It can be used as a medium of exchange. That is a valid point of it, but I primarily, given the current structure of regulations and all that, see it as kind of what Michael Saylor says is a treasury reserve asset that you borrow against. And so, let's fast forward 5 years down the line from me. I want a new CNC machine or some really expensive piece of equipment. Well, you don't have to be in business long before you start thinking like, okay, if I need $100,000 CNC machine, I've got to make, much more than that, because I need to pay tax. If I'm using using income that I've made, I have, tax burdens and stuff. Whereas like, if I just take a loan against my Bitcoin, there's no tax involved in that. And so, I need a $100,000 machine. I've got $1 million in Bitcoin. I kind of see that scenario playing out for small businesses who are saving in Bitcoin versus me paying the maker of the CNC machine in Bitcoin. I think I kind of differ from a lot of Bitcoiners that I don't spend my sats ever. And, I don't judge people who do, but, that we've all seen the stories about the cup of coffee that is now a, 5-figure cup of coffee, and
as a medium of exchange. It was in my hometown, Jacksonville, Florida. I think I spent 10,000 Bitcoin on two people. When he did, I
Laszlo.
that was like a legitimate time. It brought a lot of legitimacy to Bitcoin because it showed people you can't use this to buy goods in the real world. But at the same time, his opportunity cost for 2 Papa John's pizzas was 10,000 Bitcoin, which today is worth a lot of money.
Yeah. And, so long as the market structure and regulations, everything remain the same, and we don't do something to rein in the spending and reduce the total M2 money supply, so long as M2 keeps growing, everything is going to go to zero against Bitcoin. Literally everything: your house, your stocks, your cars, everything. And most of it is already at zero, by the way, meaning like less than one whole Bitcoin. You look at the cost of a house priced in Bitcoin; it's straight down. You look at something like Nvidia stock or Tesla. It might have a few spikes up here and there, but overall the trend is just straight to zero. And that's going to have a lot of impact on the world. And soon, like, Saifedean, I love Saifedean's example where he says Bitcoin is financial gunpowder, and that, gunpowder did not need people marketing it for it to be adopted. People, you see what's happening, and people aren't stupid. So they're going to see Bitcoiners continue to accrue purchasing power, and like eventually, and this we have to say, this is the IQ test here. It's when, not if, you are going to adopt Bitcoin, and that goes for Peter Schiff and all the Bitcoin haters. Um, it's not optional. Like it may be today, but at some point, um, gradually, then suddenly, is going to come into play. And it's like you look at water pressure building up against the dam, and eventually the dam's going to break. And for me, the only question is when.
But I think an important point too is, we brought in the United States, for as crappy as the dollar is in many ways, it's still the best fiat currency in the world, and we still have an amazing banking. We have very easy to use banking rails, and for people whose fiat currency is just completely worthless, they might be forced to use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange because that's the only money they have. And some people, whether you're using Lightning or whatever, but in the States, there's a lot of Bitcoiners who get online and say you need to spend your Bitcoin, you need to create these circular economies. And on the one hand, I think it'd be great to create more circular economies, but we're all going to follow our own incentives. And I appreciate a company like Strike where you can upload dollars, and I'm happy to pay someone in Bitcoin. But to your point, I don't want to spend my Bitcoin. So I love that Strike has that feature where I can upload dollars, I can send someone those dollars, they receive Bitcoin. There's no taxable event there because you're right, with a bunch of accounting gimmicks. So in the US, the more companies that build stuff like that. And then I also love what Zaprite's doing where, they're basically making a payment thing. So they never actually touch the money, but, they let you integrate with Stripe and Strike and all sorts of companies on the back end. And then I've heard Parker Lewis from Zaprite talk about this, where you essentially offer a discount. It's like, you want to pay in Bitcoin, 2% or 21% or whatever off. Bitcoin preferred here. We'll take fiat. And then you can, if you're in the US, you can use a solution like Strike. Or for example, I bought coffee one time from someone in El Salvador, and they wanted Bitcoin. So I used Strike, loaded up with dollars, sent them the Bitcoin, and solutions like that. I think it's great to build circular economies. But I also agree with you, spending your Bitcoin, there's a huge opportunity cost, especially if Bitcoin does what we think it's going to do. And it also ties into the point I made earlier about, someone in the audience who's not a Bitcoiner might be asking, what does the cost of capital have to do with saving in Bitcoin? The reason I brought up that example is because these big businesses have super competitive rates to borrow money, and they can invest in whatever they want. And a lot of times, the argument against a monopoly, there's plenty, but one of them is they stop being innovative, because why would you innovate if you have a massive regulatory moat where no one can compete with you? So for the small business who wants to onshore manufacturing or who wants to invest in some R&D or whatever, if they can't get a competitive loan to do said things, well, Bitcoin's twofold. Their capital will appreciate over a long enough time horizon, but then they'll also be able to borrow against that Bitcoin, especially if fiat keeps losing value at the rate it is. They'll be able to borrow against that. And Bitcoin is like the most pristine collateral in the world. You can verify it 24/7, 365. You can move it whenever and wherever. And the volatility does make it hard. You have to make sure that you have healthy loan to value ratios, or you will get margin called. But I think, as it starts to surpass the market cap of gold and keeps growing, I think that volatility will damper, and more people will demand it as collateral, because it really is just the most pristine collateral we've ever seen.
Yeah, and I think one caveat to add here is that let's imagine, as a thought experiment, that they get rid of the capital gains tax for using your coins here in the U.S. I think there's a reason they're so reluctant to do that, because at that point, why would I bother with the U.S. dollar? You know what I mean? Like, yes. I think that is the point where, maybe instead of taking a loan against my Bitcoin, I just use it.
And have you seen Mark Goodwin or Whitney Webb kind of discuss the Bitcoin dollar, and how, to your point, Bitcoin, I think the U.S. is starting to see it as a tool to extend the life of the dollar, because essentially if you want to transact, I think they're going to try and, use Bitcoin's appreciation to be able to, sell treasuries to Tether and other organizations, and almost start like backing it in but I don't want to say nefarious.
Yeah.
It expands the life of the dollar, which means the U.S. can keep printing and spending lots of money on stuff we might not agree with.
Yeah, yeah. Is so long as there's this huge accounting headache when you use your coins in the majority of the world, which I think is pretty much the case right now. Um, I think you're gonna end up boiling things down to two currencies. One is for saving, which is Bitcoin, and one is for your everyday spending, which I think will eventually just boil down to the U.S. dollar and maybe the euro and maybe one from Asia, like the Chinese yuan or something like that. But you know, uh, I think though, if you got rid of that accounting headache and we just allowed Bitcoin to be used freely as you see fit with no tax implications and no taxable event when you use it, um, it's hard to imagine the dam not really rupturing at that point for the U.S. dollar, because then like what is my reason to stay in the U.S. dollar besides maybe you know Bitcoin keeps appreciating and so you don't want to use it, but like you know we all have a finite lifespan, so it just forces you to be more responsibilist and stop buying stupid shit, um, and which I think is a great thing for society, and um, yeah, I really hope it gets to that at some point, and I really think that it will because it starts with El Salvador, right? Like there's no tax on use of crypto, and I'm pretty sure and don't quote me on this, but like I think pretty sure Dubai and some of the areas in the Far East, there's no capital gains tax on the use of your Bitcoin, and so it starts in these small countries, and eventually a big country is going to do it, and it's just going to be a domino effect, and I really think that's where it's headed. I just wonder if it's going to be in my lifetime,
Yeah, we saw the first country drop, but El Salvador is a dollarized economy, so they can't print dollars. They have to buy Bitcoin with any surplus they produce as a country. But the game theory, once you have a country that can print their own money to then buy said asset, I mean,
Yeah,
once that happens, it's when you have a country like it's hard for people to fathom $1 trillion, and I mean it's insane how many trillions of dollars we've added, but like that is such a big number, and when the country
yeah.
that can run $2 trillion deficits yearly decides, hey, maybe we need some of this Bitcoin. And I think there's
I
like what
love.
Bitcoin on the exchanges, or give or take. Obviously, people can move their coins to an exchange, but Bitcoin, like as Samson Mao talks about, that Omega candle, if you do get a country that wants to start backing it, and it's not like, we're just like speculating one day, like Donald Trump, love or hate him, he was just at the Bitcoin conference talking about making a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Kennedy was talking about buying 4 million Bitcoin. Now, there's obviously no way that they could get that many Bitcoin. Like, I mean, they'd be lucky to get a million Bitcoin, I think, unless they just tried the executive order 6102 and they took the ETFs Bitcoin. But I don't think they're going to do that because these BlackRocks and Fidelities have a lot of political sway.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
so it's, they get this is not like some like tinfoil hat one. I mean, this is in the mainstream discourse if you're paying attention.
you know what Trump said at the speech. I know that there was a lot of mixed views on his speech, but one really important takeaway from his speech is he said, Bitcoin is not the threat to the U.S. dollar. The way the government is conducting itself is the threat to the U.S. dollar, um, and we better do something, man, because I feel safe and insured because I have a pretty solid stack, but the overwhelming majority of the people you pass on the street here in the U.S. every day do not have one single sat to their name, and it worries me for the future. I just read this morning we added like 100 billion to the deficit in like a couple days, and that we're adding $1 trillion every, what was it, like 90 days or so? Um,
Yeah, yeah. Actually,
and
I have two clips I want to play for you. The first is I didn't realize this. Let me see if I can share my screen out. Um, my system settings, Microsoft Edge, share. Yep, it's fine. I know I'm gonna have to. All right. Well, I'm not gonna share my screen out because it would want me to quit and reload it. But essentially, since 2020, I think we've added we went from 23 trillion. Let me pull up the thing just to make sure I have this correct. We went from 23 trillion to 35 trillion, and we are on pace by 2030 to have 50 trillion, or 2032, $50 trillion worth of debt. So here we go. 23 trillion to 35 trillion. This is how much the debt has ballooned since January 2020. It represents a 50% increase. Again, let me say, from January 2020, so 4.5 years ago, we increased the debt from $23 trillion to $35 trillion. That is $12 trillion of debt in 4 years. I mean, shout out Michael Raheny for making that $23 trillion to $35 trillion. That's just that's so much
that's
money.
Incomprehensible. That is absolutely incomprehensible. You look at like the interest expense on the debt. This is another rabbit hole to go down. Who is receiving this interest? And I think when you go down that rabbit hole, you see why M2 hasn't, it started going down for a little bit, but then now it's going back up. And despite the high rates, traditionally you think that okay, you raise the rates, you're going to reduce the money supply. And for a few minutes there, that was true. But now we see M2 going up, and you look at okay, who is receiving this interest? Well, for example, when you have a savings account, your yield on your savings account is 9 times out of 10 just treasuries. And so it's going to everyday people, it's going to large institutions, it's going all over the place. And this new money is just getting constantly pumped into the system despite the high rates. And we're in uncharted territories right now fiscally. And you talk about debt spiral. You just showed it. This is what it looks like. And it's going to be a hockey stick. And I really, really worry for people who are not insured against this, aka people who do not have a single sat to their name. It's at what point is there going to be a stampede to the exits? Bitcoin is like our life raft in this sea of overprinted currency, and there's only 21 million boats, and right now we've got about 35 trillion. I don't know what you want to call it, square acres of money ocean, and I'm just
unfunded liabilities. It's like $200 trillion.
Oh my God, dude! Oh,
30 Medicare, Medicaid, the debt's not even full picture is the crazy part, and that's just the United States. That's not globally.
Right, we're going down one rabbit hole after another here. Unfunded liabilities is a whole other rabbit hole. Making contractual obligations that you demonstrably cannot facilitate, isn't that not called fraud? And so that's again, this is the core reason why I'm here this morning is I just want to do my part in trying to educate small business owners or just anybody watching this. I definitely want to post clips of this whole interview on Instagram and the places where I have a following, because this is so important. You are vulnerable if you do not have a single sat to your name, and if you don't get your head screwed on and wake up and see the realities that are right in front of you. And then this is a big deal. Going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, it's humbling because for majority of people, myself included, it forces you to realize, wow, I had no clue how money worked, how what money is at its core, how it works in our current US dollar system, and just what a perilous situation we're in right now, and what a dangerous situation that we find ourselves in right now. And for the longest time, there was no competitor for the US dollar. The way things were set up, the chances of a competitor a serious competitor emerging to the US dollar pre-Bitcoin was basically near zero. The system was set up in a way that I don't think if it was not for Bitcoin, I don't think there really was a way to seriously threaten the US dollar. But now, for the first time, there's an alternative. And I forget if it was Rothbard or Mises who with the some sly way quote, where like we have to like we've lost the ability to take this power from them by force. The only option is going to be some sort of roundabout sly way that they just can't stop, with guns and bombs and all the tools at the disposal of the modern nation state.
It was a high
And
quote. I don't believe we shall ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of the government. That is, we
yeah,
can't take them violently out of the hands of the government. All we can do is by some sly roundabout way introduce something they can't stop.
yeah, exactly. And what a I mean, talk about a forward thinker, predicting Bitcoin. I mean, when was that quote written down?
Let me see. F.A. Hayek. Quote about money. He died in 1992, so sometime in the 1900s. Yeah, sometime in the 1900s. 1973, maybe?
Another one I love is Henry Ford talking about an energy-based currency.
Hmm.
Um, uh, After you study Bitcoin for a while, you come to the conclusion that Michael Saylor likes to talk about, that money is really just energy. It's economic energy,
Hmm.
and um, it's amazing seeing quotes from so long ago, that are basically predicting Bitcoin before Bitcoin was discovered.
Yep. Ford, who founded the Ford Motor Company in 1903, told the publication, under the energy currency system, that standard would be a certain amount of energy exerted for 1 hour that would be equal to $1. It's simply a case of thinking and calculating in terms different from those laid down to us by the international banking group, to which we have grown so accustomed that we think there is no other desirable standard. And there's a great quote from Henry Ford, like a revolution tomorrow. One second, I'm just going to Google this. I don't watch it.
Oh, if they
It was,
understood how it worked.
yeah, it was
Yeah.
well enough that the people of the nation do not understand how our banking and monetary system work. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning.
Yeah, and you know what's funny about that is I've emerged from the Bitcoin rabbit hole a devout anarchist. I would burn the government to the ground if it was up to me. I would basically say, like, if I left a thing called government, it would basically just be something to protect the borders, and that's about it. Like, and protect property rights. So, you got some crazy person trying to steal from you via violence.
I mean, that's
Then,
literally all the government is, right? It's like literally, or that's all I should say. That's all the government should be. It should be the entity that protects property, private property. That's it. The only time it steps in is when there was a violation of private property, and it's there to dispute it. The problem is then they get some monopoly on violence, and then it starts to increase itself. And obviously, once they get a money printer, there's no function or check on their ability to grow. If for example, if you made shitty golf clubs, you would go out of business because people wouldn't buy them. You would go out of business. That
yeah,
never. The government can make the shittiest golf club. The government can make a golf club that didn't even have a head on it, but there's no forcing function for them to stop as long as they can print their own money out of thin air and fixing the money. I mean, naturally, for anyone who thinks anarchy is just chaos, there's a great book by Michael Malice called The Anarchist Handbook. There's a lot of very compelling things that really make you think through, like, anarchy is not at all what I've been sold. And for so long, people have just been fed this, like, this is the way things are and you can't change it.
yeah. As like you think your average normie thinks an anarchist is like this ski mask clad hoodlum lurking in the shadows, and in reality, an anarchist is just somebody who wants the government to leave you alone and let you live your life, you know,
Yeah, as you
and
should too.
and
Why?
and to, and yeah, and to protect your property rights. Um, and did you see Dave Smith at the Bitcoin conference? He had a great quote. He said something along the lines of, "Every evil thing government does is enabled by their ability to print money and control the financial system." When you said take any evil thing government does, whether it's blowing civilians to smithereens in Palestine, or endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or throwing people in jail for not paying the obscene taxes that we have in modern society. Every evil thing that they do is enabled by their control of the financial system. You take the evil thing, and we can sit there and reverse engineer all the way back to their ability to print money and control the financial system. You can't fight a war for 20 years like we did in Afghanistan if you have to tax your citizens who must willingly pay you, and think it's going to go anywhere. It's just not. No one would have been willing to pay for this war at a certain point after. I think after 9/11 we were all, rightfully so, wanting some retribution. But I think at a certain point we all realize, like, oh, there's some bullshit going on here.
No, exactly. And after 9/11, it basically brought an anarcho tyranny, like the current system where you punish law-abiding citizens, but then criminals don't get prosecuted. That is like the anarchy that people think of, but like that's actually under a system of a tyrannical democracy or a dictatorship where the government starts punishing, targeting people who are just trying to do business, who are just trying to do things by the books, but they make all these BS I mean, it's like straight out of Atlas Shrugged, where they don't provide any value. They're basically just like a mafia who extracts value from the people actually creating the wealth. So they're like parasites trying to suck wealth from the productive members of society. Meanwhile, the criminals, they don't prosecute. They don't keep in jail. They let the criminals run rampant. They do like this no bail type stuff, the George Soros DAs of the world, just letting criminals out immediately. That is not the anarchy we are vying for. We are basically saying we just don't want the government to interfere with private citizens. And if anything, the government should be completely public. Everything they do should be under a close eye of the public. Whereas we are the private citizens, we should have privacy, and the government's flipped it. And, to your point about 9/11, it's like, yeah, people were rightfully upset in the United States and they wanted retribution. But the antidote they gave was basically do away with all of your privacy. We have to see this so we can protect you. And it's been the like exact opposite of what you think would have, it's like, if you want to know what a government bill does, just assume it does the opposite of, what it says. The Patriot Act. That's the most unpatriotic thing. It is the Constitution. The Inflation Reduction Act. They hired 87,000 IRS agents, and I wrote an article, and I might be getting these numbers wrong, but essentially it was like 60 billion, I think, to basically employ these new 87,000 agents. And now I understand it's coming in chunks, right? So it's not like they just hired 87,000 agents right after the bill was signed into law. But nevertheless, it's cost about 60 billion in new salaries for IRS agents, and they brought in $1 billion. So think about that. They're hassling Americans for again, I could be off of these numbers, but they're hassling Americans for their taxes. They take in $1 billion, but they spent 60 billion. So they just increased the debt by 59 billion and went after a bunch of Americans who, it's not like they tell us like, this is what you owe. It's like a super convoluted process. And if you're a small business or you don't have an accountant that, or if you have an accountant, you have to pay them. And there's so much wealth extraction from the productive members of society. And what do we get in return? Very, very little.
Exactly. It is another rabbit hole here. Personally, I view my accountant as like my bodyguard that protects me from the IRS. And, same with lawyers that I've worked with. My accounting bills, and just, staying compliant. Even for me in my little tiny operation I have here costs, thousands of dollars every year. And what do I get in return for it? I'm not really seeing.
That's what you get in return.
Yeah.
You'll not be thrown in a cage by someone.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. There is good things our government does. I'm not like totally being a wet blanket here, but it's at a point right now where it's just, I work so hard to get this business off the ground and to make something out of this, and to every time I have to cut a check to the IRS, and it feels like theft, because it is theft. You are threatening me with violence and imprisonment. It's give me your money, or we're gonna send guys with guns to your house to arrest you, or you know, pick your all the unpleasant things the IRS is capable of unleashing on you. Um, it just the the modern system is just not sustainable, and it's really wild, all the different things you touch upon when you go down this Bitcoin rabbit hole. Like right now we're talking about all these terrible things the government does, and again, it all traces back to the ability to print money. Like, you can't hire those IRS agents if you don't have money to do it. Nobody's going to willingly pay a tax to hire more goons to come steal your money. So
No,
printing it is the only option.
that's the key point. Businesses have to trade in goods. If people give you money, it's because they want your good, the golf club you've designed. The government gets to trade in bads because they can print money out of thin air. There is no free market system where you could, at least for a long amount of time, pay off people to go and throw other human beings into cages for tax evasion or stuff like that. I mean, that's trading in a bad. Essentially, you pay us, or we throw you in jail for, violating tax.
Yeah.
And as long as they can print money, they can trade in bats, they can fund whatever, they can fund war. It doesn't matter. And if you take the money printer away, it's not like all the issues go away tomorrow. Humans are still humans. We still have all our flaws, but at least they cannot fund endless wars. They cannot fund all these IRS agents to go after people and make an abysmal return for going after these people. And it makes so much more sense to have like a flat tax or something like that. Like to your point, not everything the government does is awful. It's just there's no forcing function to make sure that like they're trying to actually provide legitimate value to their citizens, and as a result, the bureaucracy, the bloat grows. And what do? They naturally go after the people who do try and provide value to others, the businesses that are innovating and making a profit and actually trading in goods. They go after them and make sure that those businesses are above board. And
I see Kamala out there, and the first thing she says, we got to increase tax on corporations. Those evil corporations are not, paying a fair share, and it's just like, man, if this woman gets in and her people take control of what really worries me more than a Kamala presidency is a Kamala presidency plus her having both branches on the other side, the Senate and the House. Because let's say I've got $100,000 in profit left over at the end of the year. Another little thought experiment here. Well, at that point, I have a choice to make. The current corporate tax rate is just I think a hair over 20%. So I could not touch the $100,000 and just have to part ways with 20 of it. As an S corp, I could do some K1 distributions, but then you have to make sure that's in balance with your W2 distributions, which are taxed at. Let me put it this way: if I want $1,000 in my personal account, and I'm paying myself via a W2 distribution, which is basic earned income, I have to part ways with about $1,400, $1,450, somewhere in that range, in order to get that $1,000 into my personal account. Because there's tax on there's payroll taxes on the business. I have to pay taxes as an individual, and so to pay myself W2, the real tax rate that even though I am personally not in the top in W2 income bracket, if you just look at it on a percentage basis, what goes out of my business and what ends up in my personal account, the tax rate is roughly 40%. At that, you may as well just call it half at that point, because even after that, I still have my accounting expenses and other compliance expenses, and so how the hell do you get ahead when you're being have a shakedown? to that sort of degree. After all, and starting a business, it's very unlikely to work out for you. The overwhelming majority of businesses fail, and this is a huge reason why. Like the odds are just stacked against you, from a tax standpoint, all the way to just basic competitive forces in the business world, with established brands and stuff like that. But that's all working against you too. But then you add in these tax and regulatory scenarios, it really gets ugly quick. And um, you know, and tying this back to Bitcoin, um, if we could sit here all morning and go over the ways in which Bitcoin can alleviate this situation, a few things I can think about off the top of my head. People doing P2P Bitcoin transactions, over an encrypted messaging service. That's something you can't stop. So there's just a basic one right there. But let's say a government started saving in Bitcoin and they started getting accrued purchasing power on their Bitcoin stack. Well, then you don't have to tax people as much. And I really hope that in my lifetime that the tax situation will change, because we didn't have an income tax in this country until 1914, I think it was.
1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve. And the thing
Right.
that's so what's like Kamala and like people who want to raise taxes don't understand is raising taxes doesn't mean more tax revenue. Like I forget which Baltic country it was, but there was a Baltic country that raised taxes on the wealthy, and they predicted they were going to make X amount of dollars. It was actually a huge loss because all the wealthy people said, "Screw this."
They just left.
And that's what happens every single time. So the exact opposite effect. You think you raise taxes is going to bolster tax revenue? No, it's going to decrease taxes. I mean, it's like in Jeff Bezos of Amazon moved from Washington to Florida because the freaking bureaucrats in Washington, I don't know what the exact tax was, but they're like, we're going to have this super wealth tax and it's going to bring in X amount. And Jeff Bezos was like, see you guys, and he loved Washington. Like, I remember he wrote some long post, like, I didn't want to leave Washington, but like just becoming untenable. They're not against, they're against business owners. And so he moves to Florida and they had a huge loss in their tax thing. And it's so crazy that like the solutions are, well, how are we going to tax? It's not like, hey, maybe let's just not spend $2 trillion that we're going to have to print out of thin air. It's like, how can we take in more taxes? Like and I mean, look, the Republicans are doing it slower, but they're also guilty because it's not like they're like, we need to stop spending. Trump's solution is cut taxes. And like, look, I think that idea of cutting taxes is better than raising taxes, because when you cut taxes, ironically enough, I think it'll increase tax revenue because people will make more profit, more people want to go into business, etc. But still, it's like, why are the two solutions raise or cut taxes? Why is no one talking about cutting spending? And that's just like the third rail of politics. You talk about cutting spending, you just never get elected. So the incentives of the system are very malicious.
Right. And, if you don't touch entitlements in the military, you're not going to make a dent in the spending problem. And touching entitlements is, rest in peace to your political aspirations. And then that's the thing. Once you start using heroin, it's pretty hard to stop. And you can
it's literally heroin. I mean, it's literally crack cocaine. It is just a drug, and you just need more and more and more until the patient is just laying there lifeless because it doesn't matter how much more you get them, they've died. The system has crumbled.
Yeah, and one thing that comes to mind here, talking about all these unfortunate scenarios with taxes and regulations and all of that as a small business owner, is like, I love my country and I hate my government. Like, it's such a weird thing. Like, I love America so much. You read the Constitution and it just makes you want to thump your chest and, freedom. And I love what this country was founded on, the principles that, they were trying to protect and instill. And then you look at like the government in its current form, and it's just fundamentally evil in basically every regard. It is truly a disgusting, repugnant, choose your adjective, situation that really just makes me sad. And like, I feel like Bitcoin is a digital 1776, where, you know, you have this way to declare your independence from the tyranny that we see just rampant through modern day society. And you know, I just hope that when people look back at our generation, you know, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, that, you know, the first people who really utilize this discovery called digital scarcity and absolute scarcity, that's really what Bitcoin is. It's the discovery of absolute scarcity. And this is why I say, like, it really is on par with, you know, Newton's, Newton's, I think it's called the Principia, Einstein's relativity, the discovery of electricity, you know, these big, holy shit, world-changing discoveries. I really, in my heart, believe Bitcoin is on that sort of level in terms of what it's going to do for the world, and how it's just going to flip so many things on its head. It just got to keep getting the message out, and keep, you know, the challenge is really getting the normies on board. And I see, when are we going to see, like, just your average everyday normie allocating into Bitcoin and saving in Bitcoin? And, you know, it's a lot harder to rid yourself of fiat brain than it seems on the surface. Like right now, like you and I are well versed in this Bitcoin stuff. But, you know, if you really think back to before you knew about Bitcoin, I know personally my views of the world were much different, and the things I thought we had to do to solve the problems that we have are much different. And it really is something that I think is just going to, in 500 to 1,000 years, be looked at in the same way we look at Newton's work, as the same way we look at Einstein's work, or Thomas Edison's, all the electricity things with him and Nikola Tesla. I think we will look at Bitcoin in the same way we look at that sort of stuff.
It is so funny how magic internet money just completely changes your worldview in so many ways. Your analogy about Bitcoin being like the digital version of the U.S. Constitution is so spot on. I've written multiple articles about that idea, and it just, before, you know, to your point, I never questioned taxes or money or all this stuff. And going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, you realize, like, our founding fathers were mostly a bunch of 20-year-olds who revolted over a 2%.
Yeah.
2%. We spend, I mean, I don't know what it is where you live, but where I live in Florida, it is 7% sales tax. So if you've paid
same here.
You paid your income tax, you pay all these taxes, and then for the privilege of transacting with my money, it costs. Now, obviously, I understand some things, you know, certain foods or whatever, they don't have that tax. But, like, say I want to buy a new car, so I've been taxed on my money for payroll, or if I own the business, I'm a founder, I've been taxed, you know, however, whatever, you know, if whether you're an S corp or whatever, you get taxed before you get that income in your bank account to spend, and then you get a sales tax again to spend that money. If you die, there's an inheritance tax, or if you inherit money, there's a death tax. If you want to be an expat, if you want to leave the U.S., and it's just like, it's hard to fathom how many taxes there are when our founding fathers literally, like, gave Britain the middle finger over a 2% tax. 2%.
Yeah, man. It's wild. Like, that's one of the many things you discovered on the Bitcoin rabbit hole is holy shit. Like, there's a shakedown at every turn in modern society. And I, you know, as a business owner, I really didn't start thinking of the price and things, you know, let's say I want to go out and buy something at Best Buy today for $1,000. I don't view that price tag as $1,000. I view it as whatever I need to pay myself, including taxes, as the true cost of the item. You know, the IRS loves when you buy a $500,000 boat, or, $1 million boat with your earned income, because that means if you bought $1 million boat, you probably had to earn about $1.4 million in order to pay that $1 million from your earned income. Um, and yeah, man, I just hope that Bitcoin will be the off ramp. I joke with my parents, like, if I have several cold storage devices, and I tell my parents, if anything ever happens to me, you report one of my hard drives to the IRS after I die, like I will be rattling your windows and uh, giving you shit from beyond the grave. Um, you know, I could go on forever, man. Like you're inflaming my anarchist tendencies here.
No, but like think about like the incentives of we've always been like it's hard to understate how much the incentives of the world will shift on a Bitcoin standard. Because in the previous paradigm, say I wanted your gold, and I knew if I killed you, I could take your gold. I know for a fact that you have gold. If I kill you, I can take that gold because you can't, whoever wins a war. But if you have Bitcoin, obviously, people, I'm not saying you can't torture someone, whatever, but if you've properly secured those keys and you don't give them up, even if someone tortures you, now all of a sudden it like flips the incentives of like, yeah, I might be able to kill them, but there's no guarantee I get their value under a Bitcoin standard because it's just keys. I mean, you could memorize it, you could do all sorts of things. You could have a multi-sig distributed, and you don't, as long as you don't give up that information, it shifts the incentives of violence. I mean, you see these wars in Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Palestine, and like people want the land, they want their wealth, they want whatever, they want Ukraine's wheat fields, whatever it is. But if they stored most of their wealth, or for example, like us taking Russia's treasuries, like, I'm not saying it was right of Putin to invade Ukraine, but like it's like we just shot ourselves in the foot. And
Yeah,
if they had Bitcoin, they wouldn't be able to do that. There's no guarantee going to war. You can't just, steal someone's. And look, again, it's not like Putin did a good thing. Like it was bad he invaded Ukraine, but also Russia sold us legit goods, services, oil. It's not like, they gave us actual things for those treasuries, and we just said, no, you're done. And every other nation now is looking at our debt going, oh, so if I do something the U.S. doesn't like, the U.S. is just going to steal the wealth that we've rightfully earned. It's so stupid and short sighted of our politicians.
yeah. And one thing I really want other small business owners who are listening, or anybody listening to who is maybe new to this Bitcoin stuff, to really understand is that everything you own that is not Bitcoin is at the pleasure of somebody else. So let's look at your house, for example. You own that house at the pleasure of your local government, of the federal government. Your stocks, you own that at the pleasure of your broker, your bank, your government. Bitcoin, not only is it the first um, not only is it the discovery of absolute scarcity, the first absolutely scarce asset on earth. We can always find more gold, we can always find more silver. It is also the first asset that you can own that is not at the pleasure of somebody else. You can make the case that gold can, be that. But the problem with gold is its physicality, right? Like someone, your government can send goons to your house and take your gold basically whenever they want. But if you just have 12 words memorized in your head, suppose they could torture it out of you. But
Yeah, it just flips that incentives. I mean, golds, gun, bullets, like there's things you can have on your person. And look, obviously in the US, we're pretty lucky. I don't think the government's going to send a bunch of goons because they realize the pushback, is when the populace is armed, the Second Amendment has protected all our other amendments to some degree, even though it's not perfect. But yeah, Bitcoin's the one thing where like they can't send an F-15 to your house, blow your house up, and then like go and get sold out after the fact. Like
yeah,
they are in that over a long enough time horizon incentivizes more cooperation rather than coercion. Because if they can coerce you to give up your gold or give up whatever just with these little taxes, with all these things, it makes it just shifts the incentives to more cooperation instead of coercion, which is good. No one wants to be coerced. No one wants to be manipulated and shook down every time they do a transaction.
yeah. And you know the your average Bitcoiner these days is someone who really understands the intricacies of the monetary system, how money works, its effects on the incentive structures of the world that we've been talking about here. And as Bitcoiners continue to accrue purchasing powers, you're going to find more and more that Bitcoiners are the ones who are going to be calling the shots in the future. Let's say, we keep adding $1 trillion to the deficit every 90 days, and it just continues to be a hockey stick. You're going to find more and more that the people who adopted Bitcoin in the early years are going to be the ones that are now making the rules, because the people who don't have it are not going to have anywhere near the resources and capabilities that people who have made a decision to save in it are going to have. And so that really excites me because, you're going to have these people who really understand economic incentives, what money is, how it works. Those are the people that are going to be deciding where all this capital is allocated. Back around on the gold standard, the most responsible people in society were the ones who were the ones investing, because they save, they accrue their purchasing power and all that, and the capital allocation was a lot more responsible back then. There was way less speculation and crazy speculative frenzies like Dogecoin and Airbnbs, passive income stuff like that. You find that capital allocation was way less risky and reckless back when we were on a gold standard. And as we progress towards a Bitcoin standard, I think that's really going to start to show again that only the most responsible, knowledgeable people, aka the ones who got on a Bitcoin standard, denominated their life on a Bitcoin standard in the early days, are going to be the ones who are allocating the resources in the future. And I think that's really something to be excited about.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up capital allocation. And I want to ask another Bitcoiner about this because I've been trying to square this circle for a long time. And I don't have the best answer, but you see people who will, Keynesian economists will justify money printing because it increases GDP. Now, I don't think GDP is exactly the perfect metric to measure someone's happiness. It's a very hard and complex thing. And just because the economy is growing doesn't mean everything's good, but whatever. We'll take their statement that GDP growth is super important and we need it. And they say, well, we need to print money because we need to increase GDP. But I'd argue it leads to tons of capital misallocation, kind of as you were alluding to with Dogecoin and Airbnb. And I think it's not all VCs, but I think there's a lot of VCs who are successful in the system that otherwise wouldn't be under a hard money system. And it's like if you measure the S&P in a hard asset like gold, it's like pretty much flat, or you measure it against M2 money supply, it's pretty much flat. But if measured in dollars, it's up and to the right, because whenever they print more money, that money typically flows to the corporations, where everyone's spending their money, it goes to the top in most cases. And I just thought, like, do you think that, printing money actually does anything to increase growth, or do you think it is just leads to more capital misallocation? And I'd say I'm definitely in the latter camp because, when they spend money to buy weapons and bomb, brown people in the Middle East, that increases GDP, but there's no one that's good for it besides maybe the bloodthirsty congressmen who want to go to war like Lindsey Graham and others.
Well, all spending is spending in the Keynesian world, isn't it? Like thinking, you know, thinking you can inject liquidity to stimulate the economy is the equivalent of thinking, you can sell 100,000 tickets to a stadium that holds 50,000 people. I think it was Saifedean who he had a great quote. Money is not the resource. Money is a claim to the resource. So, like, when you just print money, all you're doing is adding claims to those seats in the stadium. So if you have $1 per one seat, and you have a 50,000 seat stadium, at 100,000, you issue more than 50,000 tickets, you are issuing more claims on the seats than the number of seats that exist. There's finite resources in the world. And so when you just print money like crazy, like we are now, all you're doing is just increasing the number of claims on whatever resource you want to talk about, whether it's electricity, water, houses, all the resources we have in the world are finite, and our ability to print money is not. And so, GDP is just another bullshit fiat statistic in my view. I think the economy cannot be described in one number. You're talking about a system that has, if you're looking at the entire world, billions of people, therefore billions of decision makers, each of whom have their own needs and wants. And it's just the height of narcissism and insanity to think that a central authority can allocate the resource better than the individuals within that system. And so I just think GDP is a on its face flawed statistic. It's kind of like the unemployment rate. Like it doesn't include people who have just fucking given up and thrown in the towel, or like how
So true. So
yeah, like the inflation rate.
yeah,
Like you ever
I mean, that, like, to say like inflation's been at like 20, like anyone who goes to the grocery store, you're a small business owner, you see it. The numbers they're giving us are so cooked, it's not even funny. And like, obviously GDP also, I'm with you to say like, well, the health of the economy, it's growing. Like it doesn't, there's just so much it can't account for. But CPI is even more cooked than GDP because it's like, you can just so blatantly see if you go to the grocery store, if you're buying stuff for your small business, if you have car insurance, like rent, any of these houses, it's all just like there's no way the numbers even in the ballpark. And the fact that they manipulate, what goes into that and change it, and oh, this is too volatile, we can't have energy and food. Oh, you mean the things that have gone up in insane amounts? No wonder you can't have it in there, because the number you're giving us is not even in the ballpark of what inflation actually is.
It's like allowing a toddler to change to change the rules of a game because they don't like how it's going for them. It's if we calculated inflation the same way we calculated it in 1980, it would not be, I would assume, not be a very pretty picture.
Oh, no.
You have these things like, oh, well, a new computer these days has a whole terabyte of storage, whereas when I built a computer for myself when I was 14, and I remember I was super pumped because I had a 256 gig hard drive, and I thought it was massive at the time. Like it was a huge hard drive, and now that's barely sufficient for
It's not
unless you have some sort of
a whole
cloud
Bitcoin
service.
blockchain. Bitcoin blockchain is 600, 700 gigs now.
Yeah, and so like, well, like look at all that increase in purchasing power that you have. And they'll include that, but of course they don't include the fact that, like, a loaf of bread is orders of magnitude more than it was in 1980. And people forget, it's like if your M2 money supply is increasing by 5% a year, I think the number is like you've lost half of your purchasing power in like 10 to 15 years or somewhere in that window, maybe even less. I forget the exact number, but it's very surprising how quickly, even at a very small percentage, year to year loss in purchasing power, how quickly you lose half your purchasing power. It's really not as long as you would think. Um, like going back to what we were saying before, like, I look at the supplies I have around my shop here. Almost all of them are at least 50% more expensive than when I started. And here's your off ramp. Here's your way out.
I think
And
Bitcoin's such a profound monetary system upgrade. It's like literally, it's like our brain is a computer. It's an operating system. It's just a huge upgrade for that operating system. And it goes back to your point that, or I guess the safety quote you mentioned, where everyone's mistaking the money for the good. I've also heard the analogy: people are mistaking the menu for the food, and
yeah.
it's it's totally different. I mean, it's insidious because if you don't think in terms of Bitcoin or you don't think in terms of sound money, realistically, it's pretty hard to measure stuff in gold. So I think Bitcoin's a much better operating system. You look at like the things you own. My house is up 100,000. This is great. It's not that your house is worth more. It's still just your house. It's just the money that we use to measure stuff in is worth less. And that's, I think, what's so hard to grasp. And I want to get your thoughts on this quote because this is pretty recent. Trump came out the other day and he said that he was going to basically, for the debt, essentially give people a little crypto coin or whatever the quote is. Yeah, here's the full clip of Trump saying, we'll pay off the national debt with Bitcoin. And it gives a little more context. And he said, it's bigger than any company in the world already. We might as well be the leader, which is not true, actually, because Bitcoin's market cap is like 1.3 trillion, give or take. And Apple, Microsoft, et cetera, some of them, Nvidia, I think is around like 3 trillion, give or take
Yeah.
500 billion. So that's not totally true. But the quote I wanted to get your opinion on this is from Max Kaiser. And he said, Trump dangerously lumps Bitcoin, crypto, stablecoins, and by extension, ETFs together. This is profoundly wrong. Trump and others also talk about backing the USD with Bitcoin. This is regrettable and very stupid. It won't make the USD any less toxic as an instrument of a rogue, hegemonic monetary dictatorship that continues pillaging global resources, engages in wars of convenience, and celebrates moral decay and indecency as virtue. Fortunately, the US and the USD is self-euthanizing via typical end of empire follies, adieu. But as many have warned, Bitcoin ETFs and USD stablecoins are not Bitcoin. When the fiat world crumbles, it will take these Franken Bitcoins with them. Self-custody, actual Bitcoin, be your own sovereign. And I wanted to read that quote to you and get your thoughts because it just ties in so nicely with what we've been saying about all these benefits of Bitcoin. And I'll caveat this by saying I understand if you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, it might make sense to get some type of multi-sig institutional setup because I can see why you don't want to have like $1 million, be able to sign $1 million worth of Bitcoin at your house. That just incentivizes, as much as it de-incentivizes violence. Obviously, if you have that much wealth in Bitcoin and one, cold card at your house, well, that's just like it's like a huge incentive for, hey, criminals, come and get me. Same reason most people don't keep $1 million at their home. But at the same time, I think Max Kaiser makes a very apt point that if hopefully shit doesn't hit the fan, hopefully it's a smooth transition. But pain's the best teacher typically, and I think a lot of people are going to learn a hard lesson. And there's going to be a lot of institutions who do buy ETF, Bitcoin, or this and that. And I hope they don't do an executive order 6102, which is when they confiscated the gold, and try and do that with Bitcoin. But I think Max Kaiser makes a good point too, that all these proxies, if shit hits the fan of the fiat system, they can do some pretty insidious stuff. As we saw with COVID, they'd probably do that again with your monetary resources. They wouldn't think twice about it. So that was a lot of different things. And but I'd love to get your thoughts on that whole speech.
Well, yeah. So this is a bit complex, but in a nutshell, he is correct. In a general sense, he is correct in what he's saying because let's say you do back the U.S. dollar with some Bitcoin, they still have the ability to print it, right? Like they can, let's say they bought 1 million coins. Will that lead to it like an increase in the value of the coins, and then theoretically at a certain point that increase is more than the debt on the books and you can pay it off? Yeah, that you could sort of see that, but like if the rules of the game constantly change, like okay, I throw some Bitcoin behind it, but then the following year I go and print a bunch of it. Well, like what have you really accomplished? Like it only is significant if you stop the printing, like and you say, we are now a one-to-one backing. If the U.S. dollar was one-to-one backed with Sats, That's and there was some sort of demonstrable ironclad way to prove that it was, which theoretically you could do. They could publish the public key, and whatever our digital Fort Knox is. That's that should be able to be audited by
Yeah,
anybody,
El
anywhere,
Salvador has done that.
anytime.
They partner with Mempool, and every day they buy a Bitcoin. I forget the website, but you can go and look up El Salvador Bitcoin Treasury, and you can see exactly how much they've been added because they share the public information. And it's beautiful. I mean, that's what a public government should do. I wouldn't recommend that for your
Exactly.
own personal holdings, but for the government, 100%, they should absolutely do that.
But assuming they won't do that, which is probably the right assumption, then Max Kaiser is right. Because no, the only reason a serious Bitcoiner like you and I would buy the ETF, for example, is because like the tax/regulatory issues in our country almost kind of like force us to, like, maybe you buy some in your 401k, in some sort of retirement plan, or I don't know, like there's some sort of regulation where like you really can't hold the keys yourself. Because every serious Bitcoiner, once you're deep enough down the rabbit hole, you really understand not your keys, not your coins. Um, you have an IOU. Like if you have $1 million of Bitcoin on Coinbase, you do not have possession of that. You have an IOU to $1 million, or a million sats or whatever you have. And that's something that honestly takes a while to understand. I mean, I bought my first Bitcoins on fucking Robinhood back in the day. So I just, it was like $3,000 a coin. It crashed. I think it was 2018. It was somewhere in the I want to say like maybe like 3.8 thousand. When I first bought some coins on Robinhood, and then it went up to 10, and I stupidly sold it. And then the pandemic happened, but I don't know if it went up to 10. It was close. It went up a lot. Then the pandemic happened, and then poof, right back down. But then I start going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and eventually you will realize that the only rational solution is just to hold your coins. And
Yeah.
so, going back to like, if the U.S. is going to hold some coins and somehow pay off the debt with it, like I could see it helping, but at that point, it if Bitcoin's going to be going up, so if it really did increase enough to the point where we could pay off the debt with our stack we have as a country, then I think you're just going to see a stampede of regular everyday people just buying sats and holding them themselves. Like why would I dick around with the U.S. dollar? And especially again, if there's no taxable event on using it, there's no reason to be in the U.S. dollar.
I think that's a catch-22. It's like maybe they could get enough Bitcoin to eventually pay off the debt. Problem with that is, people ask like, what's the top for Bitcoin? And I think once you're deep enough down the rabbit hole, unless you just have a situation where you just have an emergency and like you need fiat because you can't pay your hospital bill in Bitcoin or something like that, most Bitcoiners don't have a number they want to sell their Bitcoin at. Like to your point, maybe they'll borrow against it or something like that. But people ask like, well, what's the top of Bitcoin? How high can it go? It's like, buddy, how high can it go? The top is when people, it doesn't matter how much units of fiat currency you have, Bitcoiners are not willing to trade their Bitcoin for your fiat currency. And if the US does start buying Bitcoin with the money they can print, especially if they do it just rapidly and they don't do it in a measured fashion, I think what could happen is it could just accelerate that. And at that point, I think the government's very interested in kicking the can down the road. And look, I want the US to embrace Bitcoin. I don't want China to embrace Bitcoin and get an advantage over us with that. But at the same time, I don't know the answers, but it is interesting to think through the implications of how these people are thinking in government, how they can, kick the can down the road, how they can expand their hegemony and try and keep the dollar system going. And ultimately, I do think, we reach a point where just people don't want to accept dollars. Like the U.S. is going to be like, hey, take these dollars, and people are going to be like, well, I have no choice because you're basically giving me these dollars, or you're just, it's like, I guess I'll take the dollars, but going forward, I'm not going to give you any oil. I'm not going to give you any manufacturing goods. I'm not going to give you anything unless you pay me Bitcoin, because I don't want your worthless fiat paper that you can print out of thin air. And that's why the government's in this like weird catch-22, like Max Kaiser was saying, where they're kind of stuck. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I mean, I hope they do it pump our bags, but the top of Bitcoin is when it doesn't matter if you have $1 billion on fiat. People just aren't willing to sell you actual Bitcoin. You have to offer a good or service they want, and that's the only way you'll get their Bitcoin.
It's funny, like, China tried to ban Bitcoin mining, yet they remain one of the top, if you look at the allocation of hash rate, they've, even through the ban, are still have remained one of the top outputs of hash rate on the network. And
most authoritative government in the world, and they can't even successfully ban Bitcoin mining. It's pretty bullish for
and I would even argue that they've kind of like backtracked a little bit on their Bitcoin stance in the last year or two.
100%.
Like, you're running a fool's errand if you're going to try to stop this. History unambiguously shows that humans gravitate to the hardest money possible over the long term. Agri beads to silver to gold, and the people left holding the bag, it doesn't work out so well for them. A lot of today's third world countries are countries that either were late getting on the gold standard or never got on the gold standard. Again, it's financial gunpowder. Like, this is not optional. This is not something you can stop. And, the government can disrupt the on-ramps. They certainly have the ability to do that in the short term, but over the long term, that's just a fool's errand. If people are looking to make the best moves for themselves, if you're looking at this from a game theory perspective, there's only one conclusion that this all heads towards. I hope you and I, and having this discussion and putting it out there on our various platforms, can play some small part in educating people on this. This is not optional. You don't have a choice, and it's a question of when you adopt Bitcoin. If you're listening to this and you have not adopted Bitcoin in your own life or in your business, please realize this is not optional.
Start learning about it, or else it's going to impoverish you. Like Max Kaiser was saying, it really is
right.
Your analogy of gunpowder is a good point, and maybe you don't die. Like people who didn't adopt gunpowder obviously died in wars. Maybe you won't die, but you will be impoverished, and you'll be, working a 9-to-5 or whatever gig trying to earn some Bitcoin when you could front run literal nation states now. And you're,
right.
Quote, your heirs are going to look back at you either like a bozo for living through Bitcoin's monetization phase and not taking advantage, or you're going to be a legend, and there'll be pictures of you in the house hung up because, grandpa was able to buy Bitcoin and secure wealth for many future generations down the road.
Yeah, and the thing Austrian economics really teaches you, is Austrian economics is real economics. It's the economics that we should have learned in university and high school. It really teaches you that life is one big game of making trade-offs with your future self. And at its core, Bitcoin is the best way to protect your future self and enable and enrich and improve the life of your future self. The fiat world really blinds you to how often you are trading with your future self. Looking back at my life pre-Bitcoin, it really sickens me, some of the ways I just neglected my future self, and how I just, the blinders I had on, like it's so humbling to like realize like how misguided you were. But the truth has a way of prevailing over the long term. And I think over the next 10, 20 years, more and more quote unquote normie people um, are gonna start realizing the things that you and I have realized through our studies of all this over the last few years. And it's scary to think about the people who don't have the stats, but I think there's way more reason to be excited about moving towards a Bitcoin standard for the world than there is to be nervous. Yeah, a lot of people are going to get left behind, but I think the early adopters of Bitcoiners are definitely the kinds of people we want allocating the capital in the future. And I think even the people left behind will kind of be picked up by the people who, got on this stuff early and, made an effort to understand it and implement it in their businesses and in their lives. It's so exciting, man. Like I'm so excited. I feel like I have more optimism for the future at this point than I ever have. My Bitcoin stack is bigger than it's ever been, and my optimism for the future is orders of magnitude um, greater than any point in my life. And learning to really make these trade-offs in my future self and like stay disciplined. Don't sell a single sat. Only set aside what you can afford to not ever spend and all that. It's just been personal on a personal level. It's been life changing. I'm my business is stronger than ever, and making trade-offs with your future self is goes way beyond just stacking sats for your future self. And like once you think of your future self in a financial situation, you start thinking about, okay, like my physical health, my physical fitness. You start looking at all these trades you're making. It really wakes you up, and this is the way, as we say. and
Sure
um,
does.
and
And it's like if you look back on yourself 5 years and you don't cringe, then you haven't grown as a person. And I so appreciate you sharing your story of what you first bought Bitcoin on Robinhood. I first bought it on Coinbase. I didn't go down the rabbit hole, and then you made the point. You sold around 10K, which means like almost over 3x at that point. And
yeah,
I always tell people like learn about Bitcoin because for the I always say like the deeper down the rabbit hole you get, at first you look at it as an investment, a way to get more dollars. Then you go down the rabbit hole and you start to realize this isn't a way to get more dollars. This is a way to provide financial freedom for the rest of my life. This is the most pristine asset in the world to save in. And I never want to sell for dollars. Again, obviously, I understand there are some circumstances, you've got to pay a huge hospital bill or whatever emergency. But in most cases, I think Bitcoiners who truly gone down the rabbit hole, they understand that the end goal is not to get more dollars. It's to get as much Bitcoin as you possibly can before that window of being able to trade paper for actual finite money closes. And that's why I always, tell people to learn about Bitcoin. And I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and especially trying to educate small business owners that this monetary system upgrade is going to change the world in profound ways. And yeah, to the point where I'm so excited. And I'm an optimist as well because of Bitcoin. And I mean, we are just so blessed and lucky and fortunate to be living through the monetization of the first discovery. I think probably the only discovery of digital scarcity that we will ever see in our lifetimes. And I mean, how can you not be excited by that?
yeah. And on an ending note, like again, I just want to implore small business owners everywhere, and even if you don't own a small business, if you're just your average W-2 employee, um, please, for the love of God, for the sake of your future self, for the sake of your descendants, um, for the sake of being insured against the fiscal insanity that is on full display with our government right now. Um, get Bitcoin on your balance sheet and do not touch it. And continue to add to it over time. And it will increase in purchasing power and enable you to do more and more and more and more with your savings. And if you don't do this, you're going to get left behind. Um, it, it doesn't matter what you think of Bitcoin. It doesn't matter what you think of me or any other of the Bitcoin maxis out there. You can hate all of us. You can hate Bitcoin. It doesn't change economic reality. You have to get on board, or otherwise you're the Indian who steadfastly stood by his bow and arrow and instead of getting guns and gunpowder. You're helpless. You're a sitting duck, and you know really think about all the things we talked about here today, and try to start going down the rabbit hole yourself. I want to just always scream, like, we as Bitcoiners, we want to scream this from the rooftop. Get Bitcoin on your balance sheet. Don't touch it, and get it to a point where you can take loans against it or hold out until eventually there's no taxable event on it. But for the love of God, please get it on your balance sheet for your family, for your business, for your future self. This is so important. Because you are going to get left behind, and I don't want that for anybody, even competitors of mine. I always I'll talk about Bitcoin with any of them. I want my competitors in business on a Bitcoin standard, because we all benefit in the long run. And I just hope what we talked about here today. For anybody who might listen, maybe it encourages them to go buy a few more sats or start buying sats, to be a sovereign individual. And if we can do that, I think we've spent our time well today.
Amen. It's a beautiful place to put a bow on it. Bitcoin incentivizes way more win-win games, unlike the zero-sum games that tends to create. So, Corey, thank you so much for coming on the pod, and to anyone in the audience who took the time to listen to this whole thing, thanks for listening and learn about Bitcoin or get left behind.